and his rise to fame and power was shocking and brutal. And of course, Stalinism, which was premised on the same kind of idea, saw him as a fantastic ally, a protege, utterly anti-democratic. The democratic Chinese government of the Kuomintang was trying to crush Mao, but failed ultimately. And he did his long march and succeeded. And in fact, it's just utterly a tragic story because the Chinese suffered bitterly as a result of Mao's victory in that period. And then Mao became a sort of what you could call the politics of denunciatory anti-capitalism. So this idea that capitalism is somehow evil and therefore I'm good because I oppose it became the rhetoric of Maoism. I don't accept that principle. I think capitalism has done some good for humanity. As a liberal democrat, as a social democrat, I think capitalism has, as Marx himself said, has done a great deal for the liberation of technology and science and engineering and inventions, and the development of modernity was made possible because capitalism gave inspiration to the entrepreneurial forces that made these new inventions and ideas possible in Holland, in Britain and elsewhere. And then when this spread to New England and the Americas, some good came out of it. And just to denounce all capitalism as evil, I think is a childish intellectual mistake that shows a lack of ability to think clearly. And I've written a critique of Marx and his Das Kapital. I've sort of gone to the heart of trying to explain why Marx got this bit wrong. Although on that point about that capitalism had some value, I agree with him. But of course it needed humanizing. Capitalism in its naked and raw sense of sheer profit needs humanizing. And this was the point of T.H. Green and other great political philosophers in Britain and the early socialist tradition, the Fabian Society, which were opposing the anti-democratic wing of Marxism with a democratic socialist tradition, which I support. Unfortunately, another person that challenges the very idea of democracy is Putin. He's like a latter-day descendant of these crazy Marxist, Bolshevik, fascist types. He's stirred a pot of his own making. He's added in the Krypteia. He was a Krypteia member, and he brings in his worship of fascist ideology, such as it is. He steals ideas and creates this what's called Russism, which is an intellectual marriage of Russianism and fascism. And whatever's good for Russia is right, and if you don't like that, we'll attack you and bomb you. I mean, this is the ideology of the playground in its worst form, and yet that's what's running Russia, which is a country I know and love well. I was elected coordinator of philosophers of peace globally there in 1990 when Putin was, driving taxis in Petersburg. So he is not only an anti-democrat, he's an anti-intellectual, an anti-philosopher. And there are such things. And also he belongs to a branch of pseudo-Christianity that's the opposite of Christian democracy. These people have created this false image of Christ as a sort of emperor in the sky that is like Genghis Khan on steroids. And if you don't agree with it, you get zapped by this Christ tyrant. And therefore Putin's armies are bringing the Christ tyrant to liberate Ukraine. I mean, the whole thing is a nightmare, because Patriarch Cyril is a protege of the old Russian intelligence. He was a KGB officer like Putin. And, this is the Krypteia of Sparta all over again. In the West, intelligence services are there by constitutional law required to defend democracy. In France and, Britain and so on. In Russia, they're there to crush it, destroy it, and defend the state, which is defined as the elite that run the Kremlin. So nationalism then, unfortunately, You know, there's a democratic nationalism like Mazzini in Italy, but there was a kind of fascist nationalism in Nazism, which whipped up the mob to hate the other. And that's what Putin has done in Russiaism. And I would say it's what in India the RSS have done by whipping up this idea of India as a fascist Hindu state. I'll come back to that. So look, how can we challenge these forces that are anti-democratic? Well, through knowledge. We need to combine the best of social democracy and liberal democracy as a counterforce to these extremist forces of the right or the left. We need political democracy and liberal democracy to be a counterweight to this denunciatory otherism of both right and left extremes. We need a proper intellectual scrutiny of ideas and a political democratic scrutiny of intelligence elites as well. The misuse of intelligence is how these guys get away with it. It's the cryptia all over again. Well, I'm with Pericles. I counterpose to that, you know, the arts and poetry and literature and history and philosophy. That's what I believe in, education. In recent years, we've had it, all this has been brought home to me. I mean, I studied political philosophy at university, and it's just a kind of intellectual adventure, but it's been brought home to me how serious this is because of Brexit in the UK, which was a takeover of our democratic system, which had voted and was very happy in the European Union. Well, what went wrong? So I've discovered that, and I gave a talk about this earlier this week, which you can find, that there was an infiltration of Britain in intelligence hands of Putin. A very important new book by Calder Walton, who's a pupil of Christopher Andrew, the leading intelligence historian of Britain, historian like me. He's written a new book called Spies, The Epic Intelligence War Between East and West. And if you put together his findings, which are that Russia never accepted the Cold War was over in 91, when I was there in Moscow in 90. You know, Putin was brooding away in Petersburg, planning a fight back by Russian intelligence services. I was planning a journey for peace by intellectuals, and still am. He was finding a way to go back to war through intelligence. And that's what's led to Ukraine. So if you put together Calder Walton's research with that of Professor Tim Snyder, a professor at Yale University, a historian of Ukraine and modern history, and Malcolm Nance, who is a American intelligence operative and a colonel and is now serving in Ukraine on the front line, I'm very concerned about Trumpism and the infiltration of American democracy by Russia, by Putin. So Fiona Hill, another British-American intellectual with a PhD in international relations, and also Catherine Belton, who's an expert on the infiltration of London by Russian Putin moneyed elites, you know, who've used money to bribe their way into positions of power in democracies like in America and Britain. Now, this is a new thing, and I hope that my colleagues at Oxford and London universities are seriously studying this. I mean, because this is a takeover of democracy from within. And read Tim Snyder's work, The Road to Unfreedom, which gives the game away, and the others I mentioned. And what they did is they hacked into our social media, because the social media has given tremendous outreach now to intelligence services to plant dark ideas and false memes into people's minds. So this was done in both Britain and then with Trump's election in 2017, I think, in America. The same mechanism was at work. And we all know that Cambridge Analytica played a key role in this. And this is only really just coming to light now. So how this was done This was a coup against the British interests and the British people by engineered from Putin's GRU forces. So that is a challenge to democracy that I think nobody foresaw. When I was there in Moscow in 1990, we thought we had peace with Russia. We thought we were going to cooperate on the peace, collaborate, build a new security architecture for Europe, and that the mistakes of Stalinism would never be repeated. What we had no clue was that Putin and his ilk were actually planning Stalinism Mark II. So now what's been going on in India, because this talk is mainly addressed to Indian intellectuals, what can we do about Indian democracy? Well, the BJP, the ruling party under Modi, has essentially done the same from the same playbook. He's taken over control of public media and the messaging of the country using social media. He's confused the idea of political opposition to his government with existential threat to India. He's very cleverly sort of done the fascist sleight of hand, whereby anyone that opposes me as the ruler is an enemy of the state. No, other Indians can have different views. That's democracy. You can be a member of the Congress Party or another party, a Green Party or whatever. That doesn't mean you're anti-Indian, but what he's done in people's minds is promote this idea that Hinduism is India, which is a false idea. It's a lie. Also, he's been weaponizing thought and denouncing political rivals, in all kinds of means, and then misusing the courts and trying to neutralize political opposition, as most recently with the arrest of Rahul Gandhi. But there are many other instances, and the threat of that is enough to silence people. And then there's the use of street mobs, public terrorism, public demonstrations, which the Modi government has encouraged, and all this should be inquired into. When and if finally Modi goes down, all this should become a matter of public inquiry. And then one of the fundamental tools Modi's used is anti-Islamic rhetoric. Islam is the enemy within, and frightening Hindu rishis who ought to know better into seeing their long-term co-citizens as some kind of threat. And particularly in Kashmir, where the human rights abuse is pretty substantially documented. My friend, the Polish historian Piotr Balcerowicz, has written 3 books about human rights abuse in Kashmir, which shows horrendous stuff's been going on behind our backs, which is not at all, playing by the values of democracy. And so this ideology of the BJP has really run, the factory behind it is the RSS, which was a continuation of the Hindu Fascist Party and its movement. So, and they eulogize Hitler. I mean, these people are anti-democratic. They've done the Hitler and Mussolini thing by seizing power, using democracy, but then entrenching anti-democratic values and principles. And so eulogizing Hitler, who was an extremely anti-democratic person and scathing in his hatred of liberal democracy, and who was expert at othering, his hatred of the Jews and so on, his hatred of Freemasons. Well, the RSS have adopted all this rhetoric, which is so tragic, because I'm a lover of India, a lover of Hinduism. I've got many friends who are Hindus. I've given talks all over India. I'm an expert in Hindu philosophy, and I assure you the RSS does not represent real Hinduism. And in their eulogies of Hitler, there's an absurd irony here, because in this very important book, Hitler and India, by Vaibhav Purandari, who is a senior editor with the Times of India, this book was only published in 2021, he shows that Hitler had the most intense contempt for India. And this idea that somehow Hitler was a good guy because he was against the British, well, is absolute nonsense, because he hated the British for our love of democracy and our racial tolerance and the fact that Jews were, welcome as refugees and so on in Britain. So he hated us for all that. But he hated the Indians because they were also tinged with democracy. And they had Freemasons in high places, and they had a spiritual commitment to democracy, which he thought was... I mean, the trouble was, you see, Hitler wasn't an intellectual. He was just a junior corporal who rose to power through the power of hatred, which is very sad, It's very, very sad. But so I would say to all my Indian friends, read this book, Hitler in India, and realise that this eulogization of Hitler, which, there are cafes named after him and stuff, is just ironic. He was anti-Indian to the core. Right, so what do we do? What's the role of what can I do? Okay, so as I said before, I'm chair of the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum with Sam Petroda's help. What we're trying to do is monitor the threats to democracy, not just in India, but elsewhere in the world, and to the very idea of democracy being a public good. You see, and to counter the ruthless destructivism of, say, Putin in Ukraine, where we've just had a most tragic blowing up of a dam which has flooded a huge area of southern Ukraine, endangering lives and the fertility of the soil. It's going to make people in famine state again. And it's also endangering the nuclear power reactor, which is just nearby and takes water from the river that was dammed. And now that has been threatened. So what Putin has become is an anti-democratic destructivist who is prepared to blow up dams. I mean, it's been proven that it was a squad of Russian infiltrators that blew this dam up. That's seeing... So anti-democracy as a hater of the public good. To blow up a dam to create an ecological catastrophe like that is to me utterly shocking. It's immoral. It's beyond computation. And any Russian with a mind... I mean, I used to know the organisers of the Green Party in Russia. When I visited Moscow back in 1990, I went to talk to the Green Party there. And poor old Navalny, who's stuck in a prison, I mean, he knows about this madman, Putin, and has been trying to oppose him ever since. But so, so what can the World Intellectual Wisdom Forum do? Well, we can appoint Navalny as one of our board members. In India, we have to counter the hysterical anti-democracy language that comes from Modi and his entourage. And one of the forms it takes is a hysterical anti-Britishness. It's a kind of reverse racism. Everything British is evil, the British were terrible. Well, that's not true. We were in India for over 200 years and we did a lot of good for the country. I've travelled all over India and I've always been told by many intellectuals, we kind of miss you. This country is going to the dogs, it's corrupt, you can't do anything without bribing people. Where's the sense of values and sort of ethical integrity that used to be? So the idea that Britain is all evil and Hindu fascism is all good is simply nonsense. There were many great intellectuals, educators, academics, civil servants, geologists, scientists, natural scientists, mathematicians who were encouraged in during the time of the British Raj and did degrees in Cambridge and so on and contributed. We built this thing up, this sort of Anglo-Indian culture which was international in outlook. I mean, we've got a Hindu Prime Minister in Britain. I don't agree with his political party, but as a man he seems infinitely preferable to the last Boris Johnson and their ilk. So the other thing that we have to do is to oppose the othering that's going on in India, the attacks by Hindu mobs on Christians and Muslims, is an affront to Indian democracy and Indian values. I mean, I'm a lover of the Upanishads and the kind of Hinduism that they represent. I'm an intellectual in the tradition of Radhakrishnan, who was an expert on Vedanta and its comparison to Plato. Well, that's kind of my work. I'm a philosopher in the sense of the Upanishads and the Platonic, Neoplatonic tradition. And at that level, Hinduism isn't about othering. It's about realizing that the other is already the self. The Islam is another branch of Hinduism from this higher Upanishadic perspective. And that's why I did my commentary on the Quran, was to prove that Muhammad, bless him, was just another rishi, just another prophet who saw into the innermost fabric of being. And he had these downloads which come out in the Quran. I would really encourage my Hindu friends to read the Quran and to listen to my detailed commentary, which took me 10 years, to explain Islam from within as a perennial philosophical tradition, just like the Upanishads, as Aldous Huxley said in the Perennial Philosophy. So we also need to oppose Brexit in Britain, which is, I've given speeches and I've organised many talks against Brexit, trying to expose what was behind it, which was not democracy. It was a fake takeover of democracy by Putin's intelligence elites. And that needs saying loud and clear from the rooftops. We also have to oppose Trumpism in the US and its fake, white supremacism and its fake America, make America great again. I mean, Trump is the route to make America despised and fail as a nation. Trump himself is a miserable, unethical, bombastical, egotist and narcissist whose time is coming. I believe he will be in prison shortly. The guy's a criminal on many, many counts. We also have to oppose Putin's Russia for the same reason, which is, I think, the worst offender of this lot. And what Putin has done to democracy in Russia is shocking. If I was living in Russia, I'd be in Navalny, and I would try and work with constitutional lawyers. I would find allies in Parliament in Moscow, and I would hold meetings there. I would work with the opposition parties, and I would use constitutional law against what Putin has done. He's subverted Russian democracy, which was supposed to flourish after Yeltsin, and he's completely come in as a false leader. He's brought Russia into disrepute internationally. He's created a catastrophe in his neighbouring country, another great Slavic nation of young democrats who, wanted the best for themselves and their children and their country, and now he's doing his best to destroy it. So we have to oppose Putin's Russia. But also Netanyahu's been up to the same games in Israel. He's been weaponizing the other, the Palestinian, the evil guy, who's the terrorist bomber. And he's been clinging on to power by misusing courts and intelligence and the weaponization of the other, instead of realizing that actually, Allah is a good guy and so's Yahweh, and they're actually the same thing ultimately. They're all blood brothers, and we can be a good Israeli whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. We all love Jacob or Israel, who is a famous figure in the Quran and in Christianity. So why can't we have an inclusive, tolerant, loving kind of Israel? Well, that's what the opposition to Netanyahu want. And he has been doing everything he can in his arrogant, Trumpist Modi style to stir up hatred and rule from hatred. And not surprisingly, of course, Netanyahu and Trump and Modi and Boris Johnson have all been chums. They've all been visiting each other, patting each other on the back and saying, have you got rid of democracy yet? Isn't it a pain? Well, Johnson's gone down and ought to be in prison. Trump's gone down, hopefully to follow him to prison. It's time Putin and Netanyahu and Modi went down, because they don't have any value understanding of democracy as a spiritual force, going back to Pericles. And then there's China, China, who invaded and conquered Tibet ruthlessly, and are now threatening Taiwan. This is a false democracy that is actually weaponizing and othering, the enemy. Netanyahu has done this with occupying Palestine, periodically brutalizing it. And as chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, I would love to diffuse all that and replace that hate speech with truth speech. And I believe what is the force that can stand up against all these tyrants who use lies, power and threats and violence? Well, the force of truth. I was the education officer for the Gandhi Foundation for 7 years. I'm still a member and still support the Gandhi Foundation set up by Lord Attenborough, and worked in Kingsley Hall in London, where Gandhi himself came for the Round Table Conference in 1931. It's still like an ashram. And Gandhi said the force of truth is what can oppose violence. That's why I proposed my Parliamentary Duty of Veracity Bill for the UK Parliament, which is on my website. I suggest India and the USA and other democratic countries do this. So this is that a parliamentarian has to tell the truth by law about all official matters, or they are deselected from office immediately. Lying becomes a criminal offence in Parliament. Well, if that were true, democracy would once again be restored as a public good through a fundamental principle of political theory and democratic governance. I would like to see democratic systems through citizen participation guaranteeing parliamentary veracity as a route to, safeguarding political equality and protecting human rights. I'd love to see this parliamentary veracity bill brought in Russia and China. We'd have a different world. We'd have the world of Satyuga back, which is the world that I'm working for as an intellectual and philosopher and druid. The druids were like the rishis of the ancient Celtic world. So that's the same struggle. And the word druid meant someone that could see the Dharma, that could see the truth. So I want to finish briefly with one last little survey. So, okay, let's say I'm talking to an RSS guy and he says, oh, well, democracy, that's all very well. That's a Western idea, you can keep it. We want Hindu fascism, that's our baby. Well, I would say, no, sorry, you got it wrong there, because actually democracy is embedded in the Indian mind as well. If you go back into history and you study fantastic 2-volume work, Indian Political Thought, by V.P. Varma, which I brought back from India when I was visiting, you realise, and this guy had a PhD in political science at the University of Chicago, and was the director of the Ragjivam Ram Institute of Parliamentary Studies in Patna. You realise that actually political democracy is fundamental to Indian thought as well. And it's very interesting what he's put forward. It's the most important study of Indian political thought that I know of. And he's been an active member of the Indian Political Science Association. And the Indian Political Science Association, he's given talks and given lectures and so on. And this is really definitive. So what he explains is that, and this you can read in any worthwhile history of Indian thought, in the old tribal communities that gave rise to Jainism and Buddhism, and that gave birth to the Upanishadic culture of old Hinduism, democracy was the foundation of it. This is why in Buddhist political organisation, the monks elect the abbots. Democracy was fundamental to how Buddha saw the world, and that's why he was a bit sceptical about the gods, because gods can be manipulated by us humans. We're so sneaky. We can, I can say I'm a prophet of this god, and therefore you have to do what I want. Buddha saw all that, and that's why he suspended judgment. He said, no, don't go down that route. of purporting to be some kind of God authority, go down the humble route of just saying you're a seeker of enlightenment and follow the methodologies that work, of which one is truth-telling, right speech. And this was, I think, one of the most important contributions that India made to international political and spiritual thought in spreading Buddhism to China and Japan, Mongolia, Sri Lanka, Asia. You know, Buddha was the sage of Asia, if you want, who brought democracy to the masses by saying you can reach enlightenment if you follow these paths. That's what Christ was doing in the West, and that's why, in a sense, Rabbi Yeshua of Nazareth and Gautama Buddha were blood brothers. Later, the Theosophists said that explicitly, and we'll come to them in a minute, but the Jains had a similar ideas of the democracy of enlightenment. You know, anybody can become a Tirthankara if you work at it, if you're prepared to work for non-violence, if you're prepared to not lie and steal and cheat. If you follow the ethical path, enlightenment is there for all of us. And that's why I was such a close friend and disciple, if you want, of Acharya Tulsi and his successor, Acharya Mahapragya, in the Svetambara tradition of Jain monks. I'll come back to that at the end. So this idea of, and the Sikhs took that idea as well. Democracy in the Sikh world is very, very important. Everyone is a member of the Khalsa equally. There isn't a kind of priesthood that you have to do what that guy says. You have to follow the Guru's teachings, the Guru Granth Sahib, follow and study and look in your heart and practice prayer. And you will be led to enlightenment along that path of studentship. And in Indian thought, in Hindu traditions, it was the same. You went to the Guru that had the greatest wisdom. You would study with them, and you had to adopt non-violence to even get in the classroom door. When the British were in India, like I say, it was a complex mix, and many of the things the Mughals had done, I think, some of them were positive. They were people of great culture, some of them. Akbar, one of the greatest rulers who've ever lived. And they were great patrons of literature and philosophy and spirituality and architecture and so on. Yet there were also problems with Mughal rule, and that's why the Sikhs protested and others did. The liberalism that Akbar stood for was not a sort of general thing. Had it been so, they'd probably still be ruling India. But what happened was the British turned up and gradually replaced the Mughals as the preferred rulers through complex, partly military, partly cultural, partly intellectual, partly spiritual forces were at work. But after a couple of centuries, or a century or so of British rule, India decided to move towards independence and towards a reassertion of its inherent democratic values and wisdom. And the British became obstructed with that. Or rather, let's say some British elites did. The Congress Party was founded mainly by British theosophists who were opposing the misuse of power in India by the British elites. So Annie Besant and A.O. Hume and other intellectual leaders, of which Gandhi was also part. Gandhi was himself a theosophist, effectively. They wanted an India that would work for everybody, that would be run by the Indians, but it would be open to the Parsis, the Muslims, the Sufis, the Jains, the Christians, the Hindus, all different varieties. And that's why they were great educators. Annie Besant set up the Hindu Banaras